girls. Well, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to Liability for Negotiable Instruments. Today is an absolutely gorgeous day in Vermtown. The students are out playing with the penguins. We're having the International Business School curling competition. I mean, we've really got a full plate of activity today outside. But my purpose in life is to entertain you intellectually inside. And so we're essentially picking up where we left off last week with negotiable instruments. So let me ask this question. Is it true that negotiable instruments are normally issued to fulfill a contract? Now think about that. Well, it actually is, that's true, that it is more often to fulfill a type of contract, like a mortgage, a car loan, a bond, a check. These are all, negotiable instruments to greater and lesser degrees. We're going to talk about that today. The first question, well, not the first, it's already the second question, we're asking is, so who's entitled to enforce payment of an instrument, of a negotiable instrument? So clearly, when we have a bank that is entering into a mortgage with a debtor, certainly the debtor has a contractual obligation to pay on the instrument to the mortgage holder, who starts out more often than not, being a bank. So the holder of the instrument, in this case, let's say a mortgage or a bond or a car loan agreement, the holder of the instrument is entitled to enforce payment if there's default on the debtor's part, right? Now remember, from our last session, we talked about the shelter rule. Recall that when a transferor of an instrument, when they transfer it, they pass along with that transfer all of the rights that the transferor has under the instrument. Okay, so assume for the moment we have a mortgage, or we have a bond, or we have a car loan. When these are, resold to secondary parties, the secondary party now steps into the shoes of the original party and the original creditor, and is entitled to enforce payment. Remember the shelter rule? Anyone who's lost the instrument, how about that? Anybody who actually loses the negotiable instrument is still entitled to payment. So how does our payment process work? So let's take, for example, a check, right? We all have checking accounts. But have you ever thought about who are all the parties in play when it comes to negotiating a check, which is quite obviously a negotiable instrument, right? Well, in order for anybody to get paid, there has to be presentment, which means the holder of the instrument demands payment from somebody who's obligated to pay it. So as we're going to see, with a check, we have a maker, right? The person who makes the check. And we have the bank who the check is drawn on, and the check is payable to an identified party, and that identified party, the payee, has the legal right to demand payment from the bank, who has an obligation to pay it. Now, you're going to hear that these are legal terms of art. When you hear about a contract or a check being dishonored, what are we talking about? Dishonor, if you will, can also be synonymous with default, that the party who has an obligation to pay has refused to pay for some particular reason. And we'll be looking at those reasons in just a moment. So notice of dishonor, that is default to secondary parties, has to be given within 30 days of the dishonor, except for banks, which we're going to see have special rules that require a bank to give notice to parties presenting the check within 24 hours, or actually by midnight of the next banking day. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. So, in the commercial paper, we have what is known as signature liability, which means everybody who signs the negotiable instrument has legal liability for that instrument. So, let's take a simple check, for example. Your signature in the lower right-hand corner signifies what? It signifies your authorization for the bank to pay the payee who's named on the line above. And so you are presumed, the maker of the check, you are presumed to be what we call in the commercial paper world, the issuer. You are issuing the check to an identified party. Or it may very well be, to cash, for example. Now, if the drawee bank, the bank account, the bank signs on the face of the check, it is accepting the check, which means it's paying on it. Now, we've all signed on the back of checks that we have received, endorsing them, right? Which means, we are either depositing the check or, cashing it for money. So, we're going to dive a little deeper now into banking, if you will. So who has primary liability on a negotiable instrument? Well, certainly, it's the maker, right? The maker has primary liability on it. So if the check bounces because INS, its insufficient funds are contained in the account, the primary liability certainly rests with the maker. If we have two or more, makers, well, either one can be liable. What does joint and several liability legally mean? It means both the makers are equally liable, and or either one can be held liable when you have a check that bounces, right? So let's take, for example, Wilma. We got Wilma who issues a check drawn on her bank, payable to Penelope for $100. Now, after Penelope deposits the $100 check, the bank notifies her the check has bounced. They routinely stamp such checks insufficient funds, ISF. Well, so here's poor Penelope holding this rubber check, right? As we like to say in the business, this bounced check. Is the bank liable to the holder for refusing to pay the check? No, it is the maker who is legally liable to Penelope, right? She's the one who issued the check with insufficient funds. So when checks get presented to banks, banks have until midnight of the very next banking day to dishonor the check. If they do not dishonor the check within that period, then the check is considered as a matter of law accepted and valid. So now this is obviously all done electronically nowadays, and that's why people no longer receive their hard canceled checks, but they're all digitally available to the account holder. So let's say the bank receives a check on Friday. The bank has until midnight on Monday, assuming Monday is not a federal holiday, to dishonor the check. Now, if it fails to do so because of some electronic glitch, too bad, so sad, dear dad. The bank's left holding the bag, in the sense it has to pay on a check that it normally would dishonor, except it violated the midnight deadline. So let me give you some examples here of how this plays out so you get a chance to see how this process works. So let's assume for the moment that you're selling your home to a buyer for $200,000 cash. Now, at the closing, your buyer presents you with a personal check for $200,000. You sign over the deed in exchange for the check and the signature on the sales contract. But the next day, your bank dishonors the check because it notifies you the check is bounced. ISF. Whoa. Big trouble in River City, right? So the first question, the first legal question you would want to ask is, so who now owns your home? Yes, you may have a case of fraud or obtaining by false pretenses by the buyer, but you're going to have to sue them or file a criminal complaint. But that's beside the point. Who legally owns your home? Did you sign over the title the day before? Yes, you did. The crook owns your home. This is a problem. So that's why, as a norm, one never, ever accepts a personal check at a real estate closing. It just isn't done. And if your real estate agent allows that to happen, you need to get another agent. So, what is the standard operating procedure for the exchange of negotiable instruments in real estate closings, for example? Well, the difference is instead of using a personal check, you would require, that is, demand, and this is the norm, that a certified check or a cashier's check be used. So what is a certified check? A certified check is a stamp, actually, that a bank puts on the buyer's check that reflects the bank has taken that amount of funds, so let's say $200,000 in this case, and fenced it, set it aside to pay on that check when the check is presented to the bank, which means the buyer can't get at that $200,000. It is fenced by the bank and certified by the bank that the funds exist and that the bank has possession of them and that the bank will pay on the check when presented. Now, let me distinguish this from a cashier's check. A cashier's check is a check that is drawn on the bank, not the bank account of the buyer. So it's a bank check. And obviously a bank check for $200,000 better be good, right? So that's how those work. And talking about any serious money, I would insist on a certified check or a cashier's check. And if you get any resistance to that, because these only cost a few dollars to start with, you're talking about a $200,000 deal here, you get any pushback, that ought to put you on notice something is very, very wrong and you don't want to go through with this deal, at least in terms of signing over the title, okay? People who are resistant to getting certified checks or cashier's checks, that is trouble. And it doesn't matter how nice they are, how sweet they are, this is business. Don't be taking anything other than certified or cashier's checks in business transactions. So let's take a look at an actual case. This is a 2001 case. We got the McNabbs who purchased a piece of property from Harrington's client. The McNabbs came to the closing with a personal check drawn on a Merrill Lynch cash management account for 150,000 beans. Now the check wasn't certified. Oh boy. So Harrington called Merrill Lynch and spoke with a Mrs. Rourke, who told him that, look, there are sufficient funds in the account to cover the check, and she would place a hold on the check for its amount. She even sent him a fax attesting to this. But guess what? Yeah, Murphy's Law, right? The McNabbs account didn't actually contain sufficient funds. Uh-oh. So while the McNabbs subsequently promised to make the check good, I suppose you know what happens next. They never did. So Harrington sued the McNabbs
obtaining a judgment, but of course they didn't pay the full amount, so he sought recovery from Merrill Lynch. Guess what? The legal question presented is Merrill Lynch liable to Harrington as the drawee of the check? What's our legal rule here? A drawee, in this case Merrill Lynch, has no contract liability on a check to a payee unless and until it has accepted the check, that is, certified it. Acceptance requires the formality of the drawee's signature on the check, the bank, right? So what do we have here? Oral certification is insufficient. The UCC requires actual acceptance. Hell for Merrill Lynch. Yeah, bad guys get away. So let's talk about endorsers. We all have endorsed checks. An endorser is anyone other than the issuer, so that's obviously the maker, right, or the acceptor. An endorser only has to pay if the issuer, that is the primary party making the check, does not. How can an endorser limit their legal liability? By writing these magic words, 2 words, without recourse, next to their signature. Usually you write first without recourse and then put your signature down endorsing the check, which means you cannot be held liable if the check bounces. Clearly, when a bank certifies a check, because now they're going to be on the hook for that, when a check is presented more than 30 days after the endorsement, so checks have got to be presented, and this is what they call stale checks. So if you don't present a check to a bank for payment within 30 days, after that it becomes what we call stale. And the check, possibly may not be honored by the check. If a check gets dishonored by a drawee, a bank, then the endorser, of course, is going to be notified, usually within 30 days, and it usually happens a lot earlier than that. So that brings us to an accommodation party. So who be an accommodation party? This is anyone other than the issuer, that is the maker, or the acceptor, or an endorser who adds their signature for the purpose of being liable on it. So I'm sure you've endorsed a check before and given it as payment to another party who in turn endorses it, and they may, present it for payment to the drawee bank, or they may in turn endorse it and pass it on to yet another party in payment for some other debt. So normally an accommodation party is acting for the benefit of the accommodated party, which is, for example, a co-signer or a co-maker. And of course, they have the same liability as a holder. So what's the difference between somebody who endorses a check, I guarantee this instrument, as opposed to one who writes, I guarantee collection? Well, guarantee requires the accommodation party to pay upon demand, okay? Whereas collection requires the accommodated party's got to first default before the second party becomes liable, okay? So you see the chain? So what liability do agents have when acting on behalf of a principal? So for example, most employees are agents of their principals. Now, they have different agency authority depending on what their position is, but let's take, for example, a fast food worker, okay, an employee. Certainly an agent, they are an agent of their employer. They certainly are legally authorized to accept, money if they're selling goods. And of course, there is liability when they're acting on behalf of their principal. So how do agents become liable in situations involving negotiable paper? Well,
they can become personally liable if a holder in due course is unaware of the agency. So if you're acting on behalf of a business, but you don't tell the other party that you're an agent or an employee for a principal, the agent may become liable to the holder in due course. So when you're acting on behalf of an employer or another party, for example, so let's take a real estate agent, right? Real estate agents, act on behalf of principals. Well, to avoid liability, you want to make sure that when you sign any documents, that you sign as an agent and give the name of the principal. So that clearly makes the principal liable and not the agent. If you neglect to do that, there can be liability. So let's take, for example, Waldo Dumgarten. So Waldo, if he signs Waldo Dumgarten, agent, or who's the principal? Agent for whom? Who is Waldo the agent for? Well, if you don't know that, then obviously the only person left is Waldo. Or how about if he just signs, Turkeys R Us? Who is Turkeys R Us? And so it's important for a agent to sign as an agent for, just Turkeys R Us. So you've identified not only your agency status, but who the principal is. That makes the principal primarily liable on negotiable instruments, right? That the agent may handle on behalf of the principal. How about signature authority? Lots of businesses give signature authority to employees to issue checks and to make payments on behalf of the principal. So we call that signature authority. Well, if the agent has the actual signature authority on the principal's bank account, in other words, they're signed on the bank account, the signature card authorized to sign checks, then clearly no personal liability exists for the agent. But we do have what's called warranty liability. Warranty liability arises when someone receives payment on an instrument, obviously on behalf of another. And so clearly when you receive that, there is responsibility and liability that comes into play. So let's talk about warranty liability in greater detail. Clearly, if we have someone who, without authority, makes payments to themselves or other parties, we would say that person is fundamentally a wrongdoer, right? And so a wrongdoer is always going to be legally liable to the principals and other parties involved. But more often than not, wrongdoers are hard to find when the you-know-what hits the fan. Now, a drawee bank is liable if it pays a check on which the drawer's name is forged, all right? So a drawee bank can only pay upon genuine signatures. And if there's a forged signature and the bank pays on that forged signature, it is the bank who is liable. And they can't recover against the payee unless there's reason to suspect there's been forgery involved. Forgery involving endorsements and signatures and so forth. So, a person who first acquires an instrument from a wrongdoer is ultimately liable to anyone else who pays value for it. Why is all this important? Well, let's take Waldo again. So we got Waldo who receives a promissory note from his roommate, signed by his roommate's wealthy father, indicating he will give his son 1/3 of his $6 million inheritance when he reaches 25 years of age, which will be next month. Now, the roommate needs cash now, so Waldo loans him $100,000 in exchange for the note, which his roommate endorses over to him. Everything sounds great, right? Now, Waldo sells the note to Tricken Loans for $150,000, which subsequently discovers the wealthy father's signature and the promissory note to be a forgery. So the question legally arises, does Waldo have any liability to trick it? What do you think? Yeah, there is liability here. We have what is called transfer warranty. When transferring an instrument, the transferor, in this case Waldo, warrants he is the legitimate owner of the instrument. This is what Waldo is required under the transfer warranty to do. The signatures are authentic and authorized. Uh-oh. The instrument hasn't been altered. No defense can be asserted against it. And as far as it is known, the issuer is solvent. Well, we got some problems here, right? Waldo's got problems because the signatures are not authentic and certainly aren't authorized. So we got a forgery here. So Waldo is the one who is liable to tricking. So on page 662 of your text, there's an example that I think really clarifies or illustrates this issue as well. So we've got Annie who writes a check for $100 to pay for dinner at Barbara's Bistro. But Cecilia, who's an employee, steals the check from Bistro's cash register. Now, Cecilia forges Barbara's name and uses the check to buy a leather jacket from Deidre. Deidre endorses the check over to her condo association to pay her monthly service fee. So you see how the negotiable paper is moved around? When Barbara notices that the check is gone from her cash register, she notifies Annie, right, who made the original check, of its theft, and Annie issues a stop payment order to the bank. So what happens next? Well, the condo association cannot then cash the check because of Annie's stop order, right? So what's our legal question? Who is liable on this check? Cecilia is liable on the check. The thief is, of course, liable, but of course, nowhere to be found like most thieves, right? So the condo association makes a claim against poor Deidre, the leather coat seller, right? She warranted, remember the transfer warranty? Deidre warranted under this rule that all signatures were valid, which turned out to be false because Cecilia forged Barbara's signature to start with. Deidre is left holding the bag of liability because she should have asked Cecilia for ID, right? She cannot make a claim against Annie or Barbara because neither of them violated their transfer warranties. So, you see how this works? So, why is all this important? The lesson learned here is that you want to check identifications of all check transferors to make sure they are who they represent themselves to be. Here's another interesting case, the Quimby versus B of A case. We got Zabo, who's a Venezuela resident, had a checking account with the Bank of America branch in Florida. Someone with a Nigerian internet address, you've seen those, right? Hacked into Zabo's account online and called the customer service department to change the account and telephone number and to order blank checks. Uh-oh. Someone then wrote a check on Zabo's account for $120,000 to pay for an investment in Quimby's gold mine. So on February 20th, Quimby presented the check to a Bank of America branch in Idaho. At Quimby West, the branch manager verified that Zabo's account had sufficient funds to cover the check. The branch manager also called the account telephone number and spoke to someone claiming to be Zabo, who confirmed the check was valid. So Quimby endorsed the check and received in return a cashier's check for $120,000, which he deposited in his B of A account in California. Now, Zabo then allegedly contacted Quimby, claiming he had changed his mind and now wanted a return of the funds. So Quimby wired $111,000 from his Bank of America account to an account in Hong Kong. And of course, those funds disappeared. Surprise, surprise. So on March 3rd, the real Szabo reported to the bank his signature on the Quimby check was a forgery. The bank repaid Szabo. Okay, why? Because, hey, the bank's liable on forgeries, right? And they got notified by Szabo of the forgery. So the original Szabo, doesn't have any liability here. And then the bank filed suit against Quimby seeking repayment of the cashier's check with interest. The bank claimed Quimby had violated his transfer warranties when he endorsed the forged check to it. So what's our legal issue? Did Quimby violate his transfer warranties, and is he liable to B of A for the $120,000? What's our legal rule? Endorsement of a forged check violates the transfer warranty rule. The Szabo check was a forgery, right, from the start. Yet Quimby warranted it was authentic and authorized it when he endorsed it to the B of A. So here, B of A wins, Quimby loses. So we've looked at signature liability, we've looked at transfer warranties, and you need to look at them together, conjunctively, if you will, to determine negotiable instrument liability. Why is a forged signature invalid, creating no signature liability on the part of a person whose name is signed? Well, public policy says, look, you can't hold liable a party that didn't authorize the payment to start with. It is the obligation of the drawee bank and other parties to confirm the true identity of the endorsers and the signatures that are to be found on the negotiable instrument. Why doesn't the signature rule apply to bare paper? Now remember what bare paper is? So whoever holds the paper can demand upon presentment payment. Whoever that is, no signatures are required. Bare paper means whoever bears the paper has legal ownership or legal rights to cash in the bearer paper. And bearer paper is negotiated, that is, legally transferred by delivery, not signature. There are no endorsements required because there are no names on bearer paper. So, what are presentment warranties? What are the warranties that a party that is presenting a negotiable instrument are making? Anyone who presents a check is required by the South Dakota Uniform Commercial Code, Article 3, and all other similar state UCCs to make the following warranties. And what is a warranty fundamentally? It's a promise, right? It's a promise. So these are the presentment promises that are being made by the person who is presenting the instrument for payment. First, they are asserting that they are a holder of the instrument, that the check has not been altered, that the presenter has no reason to believe the drawer's signature is forged. And with respect to promissory notes only, there is only one warranty, that the presenter is a holder, and that presentment warranties apply when the instrument returns to the maker or the drawee for payment. So you see how negotiable paper flows through our commercial banking system. Conversion. Conversion is a criminal crime as well as a civil offense. So what is conversion? This is when somebody has stolen an instrument or a bank has paid a check that has a forged endorsement. So what's happening? We have a party that is converting the funds of another for their own unlawful purpose. What's the imposter rule? If someone issues an instrument to an imposter, then any endorsement in the name of the imposter payee is valid as long as the person or bank who pays the instrument doesn't know of the fraud. You follow how the imposter rule works? So again, we're back to the necessity for identification, right? Real identification. And obviously, if you're dealing with somebody you don't know, you're dealing with a big ticket item. In other words, you're talking about big money. You may very well want more than just a driver's license. You may want, a lot of other documentation to make sure you're dealing with a legitimate party. What's our fictitious payee rule? You see this sometimes in business where a person steals checks from a business and then pays themselves or pays third parties using it. If someone issues an instrument to a person who doesn't exist, then any endorsement in the name of the payee is valid as long as the bank or the party pays the instrument. When they pay the instrument, they don't know of the fraud. No harm, no foul, right? If they don't know of the fraud. The employee endorsement rule: if an employee has responsibility for issuing instruments and forges a check or other instrument, then any endorsement in the name of the payee or a similar name is valid as long as the bank or the person who pays the instrument doesn't know of the fraud. Clearly, once they know of the fraud, you can't have a valid transfer. Doesn't apply if the employee is not authorized to issue instruments, but forges them instead. So that would be the case of where company checks are stolen and then they're forged. What about negligence? What is negligence? The failure to use, not sue, failure to use due care under the circumstances. Anyone who behaves negligently in creating or paying an unauthorized instrument is liable to an innocent third party. So anyone who carelessly creates a situation that facilitates forgery or alteration of an instrument can't recover against the party who pays the instrument in faith. So let's take the Gulf States versus Whitney National Bank case. This really illustrates the rules here. So we got the executive director of the Gulf States section of the Professional Golfers Association, who's responsible for paying its bills and handling its bank accounts. His secretary stole checks kept beneath the printer stand in his office and forged 18 PGA checks totaling $22,699 during a 4-month period. Now, to cover her tracks, she intercepted and altered monthly bank statements. She subsequently disappeared. Surprise, surprise. Now, while Whitney National Bank had a policy to verify signatures on checks in the amount equal to or greater than $5,000, one of the forged checks was in the amount of $5,000, but Whitney didn't make a check or verify the signatures. The question is Whitney liable to the PEA? Is the Whitney National Bank liable to the PGA for the forged checks by the secretary that it paid? Under the signature liability UCC requirement, the bank is liable for paying on forged checks, right? Now, the UCC imposed upon a bank customer a duty to exercise reasonable care and promptness to examine his bank statement to discover any unauthorized signatures or alterations to items, and to notify the bank after discovery if there's anything untoward going on. So if the customer failed to comply with these duties, he was precluded, that is, prevented from later asserting against the bank the unauthorized signature or any alteration of the item if the bank also suffered a loss, and so forth. So, what's our situation here? What do you think? Yeah, the executive director was negligent in his security of the checks and, importantly, failure to reconcile his monthly statements. So do you see why it's important for you personally each month to go over not only your personal bank statements, but certainly the bank statements, and to make sure they balance of any business that you're involved in? So what are, crimes that one can find in negotiable instrument transfer? Well, certainly bouncing a check can be a crime. What about check kiting? That's, making deposits, writing check deposits to an account and then writing checks on that account before the deposited checks have a chance to clear. Yeah, that's unlawful. And then, of course, forgery. That is representing somebody else's signature as your own, obviously involves criminal intent. Are there any actions that might discharge an obligor, that is a bank, for example, from its duties to pay? Well, certainly by payment of the underlying obligation, by agreement of the parties to the instrument that no further payment is needed. This has to be in writing, though. It can't be an oral, oh, hey, this, payment's enough. I know you still owe me $10, but forget it. No, it's got to be in writing in order to be a valid discharge of legal duties. By cancellation, intentional cancellation of the underlying debt or contract, voluntary surrender, destruction, or disfigurement of an instrument, by certification when the bank certifies or accepts a check, and certainly by alteration when there's an intentional change. So that's why if somebody fools with the numbers on a check, alters them in any way, that automatically cancels the validity of the negotiable instrument. The Manley versus Wachovia case is an interesting case. Again, involves some fairly interesting and crazy behavior. Certainly, if you were paying off a debt with $375,000 in cash, you'd think there's no way you would leave without a receipt, right? And of course, this particular not so bright debtor did leave without a receipt. They supposedly received in the mail a surrender note and stamping it that it was paid. However, the bank claims that that was all done by mistake and that it wasn't intentional or voluntary, but that the debtor receiving the note stamped paid in the Wachovia envelope did not prove that the debt had been extinguished. And so any change in the instrument that harms an endorser or accommodation party discharges them from any obligation unless they consent to the change. So you can see why it's important not to alter any documents unless you get the consent of the other parties, and traditionally create new documents in order to supplant or replace those. So this is clearly very technical material. Go over this chapter very carefully, because there are obviously going to be questions similar to the ones that we've gone over that you'll see pop up on our quiz and assessment exams. So as always, I solicit your emails and questions. Anything I can do, please let me know. I am available during the week, so I look forward to hearing from you. Hopefully all is going well for you. Take it easy and stay well. Bye-bye.